Hey there, guys. All right, today we are back with some more overly sarcastic productions, and this time one that is not going to be as depressing as the previous trope talk. This one, well, it could be. There's a chance that it could be depending on how she approaches this topic, because yeah, villains tend to be uh, represented by minority. So yeah, historically perhaps a little problematic. This is queer coded villains. Now, before we dive in, make sure you go and check out the links in the description box below. I would love it if you join the Discord and follow me over at Twitch. Now, I don't really know like the why of this, aside from I don't know. Yeah, I don't really have anything to say at the beginning of this video. Except for I had to fucking yawn for some reason. Holy shit. But yeah, for whatever reason, villains typically, or there's a sizable amount of villains that get coded queer. Why is that? I don't know. Um, let's hear what Red will say. Something smart.
This video was sponsored by Campfire Blaze. Insert flaming joke here. Warning, this video uses the word queer in a reclaimed way like a whole bunch. Like I say it more than 100 times. If that upsets you, you probably won't have a good time watching this video, and I'm kind of questioning why you even clicked on it. Okay, here we go. The Motion Picture Production Code of 1930, more commonly known as the Hays Code, was a set of self-censorship industry guidelines that basically defined what movies.
Hold on, I've never read this. 1. No picture shall be produced which will lower the moral standards of those who see it. Hence, the sympathy of the audience should never be thrown to the side of crime, wrongdoing, evil, or sin. 2. Correct standards of life, subject only to the requirements of drama and entertainment, shall be presented. 3. Law, natural or human, shall not be ridiculed, nor shall sympathy be created for its violation. They should never be more than suggested and only when essential for the plot, and even then never shown by the explicit method. That has changed. They are never the proper subject for comedy. Perversion or any inference to it is forbidden. White slavery shall not be treated. Oh, but black slavery, yeah. Oh, okay, this is the real OG one. Yeah. And here these are not served for motion pictures. Scenes that factor in silhouette are never to be presented. Okay, the children one is absolutely valid and should remain. Yes. Indecent or undue exposure is forbidden. Dancing costumes intended to permit undue exposure. Indecent movements in the dance are forbidden. So much sexual forbidden stuff. No film or episode may throw ridicule or any religious claims. Minister and their characters ministers should not be used as comic characters or as villains. Okay, so a lot of these are definitely no longer around.
We're allowed to do. It covers a lot of ground, but broadly it puts forward and enforces the following 3 general principles. 1. No picture shall be produced that will lower the moral standards of those who see it. Hence, the sympathy of the audience should never be thrown to the side of crime, wrongdoing, evil, or sin. 2. Correct standards of life, subject only to the requirements of drama and entertainment, shall be presented. And 3. Law, natural or human, shall not be ridiculed, nor shall sympathy be created for its violation. And to be honest, I could stop the video here. This right here is the chemical formula for the queer-coded villainy trope. Between 1934 and 1968, this standard was strongly enforced in US film production down to the letter. Your movie could not portray sin or violations of the natural law in any kind of sympathetic context, which means if you wanted to put queer stuff in your movie, your only option was to put it on a bad guy. The Hays Code also prohibited things like masculine women, feminine men, and interracial relationships. The 30s through 60s. But it's not like the Hays Code invented the idea that these things were.
What is Legolas I've never really pictured Legolas as feminine. Really, I mean, yeah, young Orlando Bloom kind of has that face, and the long hair kind of makes him look a little bit more feminine, but really, I would say the hobbits were more feminine than any of the other characters. Like Legolas doesn't talk. I would say, the hobbits definitely were more feminine.
bad. The concept that queerness is some kind of unnatural crime or sin instead of just being, a way people can exist is pretty old and well established at this point, but more importantly than the whole discrimination and criminalization thing, for decades if not centuries in the US and
The prevailing attitude was we all know they exist, but we refuse under any circumstance to admit it. And if we have to acknowledge it, we must punish it as harshly as humanly possible. Even though,
UK, the most popular attitude towards that sparkling rainbow of human diversity was that it was a thing, sure, but nobody was allowed to acknowledge it. You couldn't be upfront or overt about queer tendencies, those were private and shameful, and you would be super arrested and punished if you were caught being queer too loudly. It's not that these identities didn't exist or weren't known about, it's that they were mostly obscured, actively punished, or most commonly referred to with obfuscating, polite euphemisms to discreetly imply that someone was queer without making any concrete statements that would violate the sweeping agreement that these people's very existence was fundamentally indecent, embarrassing, or otherwise a problem to be covered up or fixed. Men weren't gay, they were confirmed bachelors. That woman isn't partnered with that man because they're mutually covering up their own queer identities by giving each other plausible deniability while seeing people they're actually attracted to on the side. They're just in a lavender marriage. Those two independently wealthy New England women aren't living together because they're lesbians, they're just in a Boston marriage.
They're
that woman you never
roommates.
seemed interested in getting married or settling down isn't asexual or aromantic or a lesbian, she's a spinster. That guy who publicly stated he was bisexual was probably just joking. This person who dressed in
Hold on, what? You've been asked the question whether you're bisexual or not. Yes, too many times. Yes, and you've never quite answered it. Oh, I have. I said I was bisexual. That's enough. Who is... That face looks familiar. Is that David Bowie? Wait a minute. That looks like a young David. Okay, yeah, that is him. Yeah, 1979. It was just the black and white was throwing me off. I was like, that looks like David Bowie. But why is it black and white?
guy who publicly stated he was bisexual was probably
And why did she say this guy? David Bowie, Red. They're David Bowie.
just joking. This person who dressed and lived publicly as a man their whole life and took great pains to make sure nobody found out they weren't assigned male at birth wasn't a trans man. Maybe they were just really committed to going to medical school. It's not automatically this queer thing, so it's totally kosher. It's all about the plausible deniability, baby. Basically all this to say that while queer identities have always existed and always been known to a degree,
Veneer of deniability, aka the closet, shielded queer identities from punishment. Openly queer tendencies violated this tacit understanding and were often punished horrendously.
until very recently, the prevailing attitude was that they had to be kept secret and private, and any kind of publicly visible queerness had to be smacked down as harshly as possible. This attitude manifested in lots of different ways. Some people treated
I wonder how much of this is also kind of tied to America's very Puritan roots, Like, USA's kind of prudish. If I'm being honest, the USA is pretty prudish. So, like, this, of course, does not just stem towards what I'm saying here does not just isn't just talking about queer people, but also, just like sex in general. The USA is very Puritan.
it like a sin that people had a religious obligation to oppose in all its forms, while some people took the slightly more charitable attitude that it wasn't inherently a problem as long as they kept it quiet and consensual and not in my backyard and don't ask, don't tell. Of course, in practice, this was not true. For instance, Alan Turing and Oscar Wilde were both famously punished absolutely horrendously for private consensual relationships with other men. And while Turing was a very private guy, Oscar Wilde is kind of famous for being flamboyant and a historical queer
Really, you look at a pic at that and you're like, nah. I don't know how anyone could look at that and be like, yeah, that man is
icon. But even he kept his actual queer relationships on the DL as much as possible, actually taking the Marquess of Queensberry to court for libel when he accused him of sleeping with his son, which by all accounts Wilde was doing. Unfortunately, during that case, Wilde's gay relationships were exposed by a team of private detectives which
Wait, hold on. Let's go back to the son bit. What? Huh?
Court for libel when he accused him of sleeping with his son, which by all accounts Wilde was doing. Unfortunately,
hold on. Wait, no. Like, hold on. We can't just... Someone explain that more in depth to me, please.
during that case, Wilde's gay relationships were exposed by a team of private...
Like, was it actually his son? Please no.
Private detectives, which flipped the case on its head and turned the whole trial into a sham, after which his life was basically systematically destroyed. First, he denied everything, but when he was arrested and tried after pleading not guilty, he ended up undercutting himself by delivering a heartbreakingly beautiful defense of the love that dare not speak its name.
What is the love that dare not speak its name? The love that dare not speak its name in this century is such a great affection of an elder for a younger man as there was between David and Jonathan. Such as Plato made the very basis of his philosophy, and such as you find in the sonnets of Michelangelo and Shakespeare. It is that deep spiritual affection that is as pure as it is perfect. It takes and pervades great works of art like those of Shakespeare and Michelangelo, and those two letters of mine such as they are. It is in this century misunderstood, so much misunderstood, that it may be described as the love that dare not speak its name, and on that account of it I am placed where I am now. It is beautiful, it is fine, it is the noblest form of affection. There is nothing unnatural about it. It is intellectual, and it repeatedly exists between an older and a younger man. When the older man has intellect and the younger man has all the joy, hope, and glamour of life before him. That it should be so, the world does not understand. The world mocks at it and sometimes puts one in the pillory for it. Now, Oscar Wilde, how... We do need to be concerned a little bit over the age gap, right? That is something that must be addressed, right? And what was the age gap between Oscar Wilde and his lover? I'm concerned over what the answer could be. Oscar Wilde. Come on, man. Don't do this. Don't be a creep and be going after men that young. Please don't. Like, if you're in your 40s and they're in their 20s, yeah, that's fine. Yeah, that's fine. You're younger than their 20s. That's not fine. That's not fine at all. Don't like, if you're over 20, you should not be talking to people under 20. Yeah. Actually, more specific, like, yeah.
And how that kind of love between two men is perfectly natural, beautiful, and noble, dating back to ancient Greece, and it's not the fault of the love that the modern world doesn't understand it. It was, unfortunately, kind of the opposite of a legal defense, and he ended up doing 2 years of hard labor and was never the same afterwards, actually dying shortly after his release. This is a very long and depressing way to say that the
IRL social context for queer-coded villains. Queer identities are known-ish, but are not directly acknowledged. Oblique, polite references that aren't explicit confirmation are semi-accepted. Confirmed queer behavior is entirely unacceptable and harshly punished. Hays Code forbids sympathy with sin.
real-world social context for the corpus of literature that created the queer code.
You know, I should have saved this video for, Pride Month. Should have watched this back in June. Damn.
Villain trope was an environment where queerness was known and acknowledged as what amounted to an open secret, but the minute the social contract was violated and queerness was publicly acknowledged or exposed, it was violently punished for being indecent, unnatural, or wrong, despite demonstrably being none of those things. God, calling someone out for public indecency when you had to hire a team of private detectives to find them out would be so funny if it hadn't ruined so many lives. So, this is the fertile soil that gave rise to the Hays Code, which put down on paper the principles that most people had been operating on for decades already. People were impressionable, media influenced reality, and it was very important for that media to be ideologically pure so as to promote good morals and traditional values and buzzword. Basically, between this and the prevailing attitude towards queerness, popular media gave queer identities the same two options that reality did: hide their existence as much as possible, or expose their existence and suffer. With the added moralistic flavoring that queerness was an inherently evil or sinful thing that could not be glorified under any circumstances, the wonderful world of fictional moral absolutism meant that your heroes could not be queer in any way, but your villains could, as long as they were suitably punished in the end. From this primordial media soup arises the queer-coded villain in all their glory. Everything taboo and indecent in reality embodied totally unsubtly on the silver screen. Men who are visibly effeminate, women who are visibly masculine, villains who are actively hypersexual, acting in publicly suggestive ways towards people who their attraction to is totally unacceptable. This media made no distinction between traits that were currently socially unacceptable and traits that were fundamentally evil, so villains got their pick of the pack while heroes tended to be extremely bland. But the Hays Code really only lasted about 30 years, and near the end there, it was already being pretty thoroughly lambasted because it was, stupid. It held all of American cinema to the moral standard of a Care Bears episode, not to mention it treated audiences like gullible morons who would see an ounce of moral complexity on screen and become so tilted it'd lead to the immediate downfall of civilization. And from their perspective on what defines civilization, they might have been right. Forcing an audience to exclusively consume media that conforms to a fundamentally false moral dichotomy is pretty much the only way to keep that audience buying that moral dichotomy. If movies were allowed to show queer characters that weren't evil villains, it might make the audience think that being queer was actually totally fine and harmless. And hey, look where we are now. Progress. Most people agree that the final nail in the Hays Code coffin was Some Like It Hot, a wildly successful comedy where two musicians dress in drag to escape the mafia and end up in a whole mess of gender-bending romantic shenanigans completely unacceptable by the Hays Code standards.
Let me tell you, they look good in drag. They look real good.
In the final scene of the movie, one of the musicians exasperatedly reveals to his smitten would-be suitor that he's a guy, to which the man replies, well, nobody's perfect, and keeps driving. But yeah, the Hays Code gradually faded into obscurity, but that doesn't mean the tropes it fostered just went away. The queer-coded villain trope that grew in this basic moralized environment persisted even after the social context that created it began to wither. 1969 saw the turning point of the Stonewall riots, while the 70s saw the first organized pride parades, and broadly heralded the beginning of the transition to where we are now. Queer identities being publicly acknowledged and celebrated has become the mainstream attitude, while bigotry is considered the embarrassing, unfortunate reality best swept under the rug. Of course, a simple turn of the tables this is not, because
where we are now-ish, public acceptance of queer identities is slowly becoming the expected norm. Brands now publicly support and celebrate. Well, I wouldn't say they celebrate the money that comes with publicly supporting it. Most brands, the vast majority of them, their support is very much a veneer, a facade, not real. For instance, and public tolerance for queerphobia is correspondingly shrinking. Laws that protect queer identities are becoming more common, removing or negating laws that actively punish them. There's a long way to go, but it's gotten way better.
Because while the trait of queerness is inherent, the trait of being an asshole is selective. Look, I know some people are terrible, alright? I don't mind. I just need them to not be terrible around me, okay? But while society may have been marching on, tropes tend to be a little slower to change. There's momentum to literary movements, and since creators are largely inspired by the works of earlier creators, generational tropes can manifest where a new wave of creators produce a new wave of an earlier trope that they previously internalized. Queer-coded villains underwent a somewhat subtle shift around this time, and I'm not entirely sure where it came from, but I have a hunch. See, queer-coded villains, despite being the most generic dag-nasty evil they can be, are often very beloved by fans and creators alike. This cannot have been true when the trope started, since the whole purpose of the Hays Code was to make sure to portray these characters as negatively as possible so nobody in the audience got any funny ideas. But just by making these characters flamboyantly, unapologetically themselves, even if it was so they could be punished by the narrative for doing those things, the characters often ended up resonating with the audience, and not just the closeted queer audience. Defying the social order to unapologetically exist is the kind of personal narrative that can resonate with anyone who doesn't comfortably 100% fit into the social order, whatever it may be. Those 3 decades worth of Hays Code-approved queer-coded villains might have been intended to enforce the status quo, but they're—
I mean, hell, I'd say it also kind of goes back to American roots of that, the common perceived American roots, how most Americans want to see the origins of the country, and that rebellious nature, right? You know, a queer-coded villain being so unapologetically themselves, I think also ties into that whole rebellious nature. And so that is, of course, going to appeal to a good chunk of also, the common accepted American origin. Of course, we know if you actually study the history of the American Revolution, we know it's not as, it's just the bourgeoisie rebelling for more money, for more control over how they get their money and stuff. It wasn't a popular, but right, most people believe, a good chunk, not most, kind of see it as just like a rebellious sort of kind of thing, like being American is also like being rebellious or whatever.
Their transgressive nature still taught the audience that the status quo could be disrupted. Somewhere along the line, I think this transformed the trope itself. The focus of the character was no longer on how evil and debauched they were, it was on how they existed in a fundamentally transgressive way, a trait that a surprising number of people can sympathize with. Now, I may not know exactly when this first manifested, but I know when it got big, and it's all thanks to Disney. Classic archetypical Disney villains are frequently queer-coded, the most blatant example being Ursula, whose visual design was completely based on famous drag queen Divine. But most Disney villains were a combination combination of flamboyant, immensely self-confident, and in some way fundamentally transgressive. Even the male villains who are explicitly attracted to women don't avoid being queer-coded with traits like vanity or a general love of drama that are associated with femininity or the broad space of queer stereotypes. And these characters are beloved. Well, maybe not Gaston, but they're almost always the most interesting people
But Gaston's songs are beloved.
in their movies, and even if we know that they're gonna lose in the end, it's still very fun to watch them sweep around like they own the place, singing about how diabolical they are. Now, there's one problem here. It's not easy nailing down what exact traits constitute queer coding, so it's hard to definitively argue that a given character is queer coded or not. But like all coding, queer coding draws on the corpus of stereotypes. If something is a queer stereotype, applying it to a character can make them queer coded. For instance, Disney's portrayal of Hades has a few traits in common with the sassy gay best friend type. Scar, despite being, a lion, has some flamboyant body language that makes a lot of people think, kinda gay. Captain Hook is very flamboyant and swishy, and his whole thing with Smee is, well, a thing. Cruella de Vil is a powerful, bossy older woman with a husband who's never named and a ridiculously over-the-top personality, and she's just got this vibe, you know? And this one's kind of interesting. A lot of Disney villains express a general skepticism or detached amusement about the obligatory romantic subplot between the mandatory heterosexual couple of pretty young heroes, from eye-rolling all the way up to dismissing the existence of true love. This is less of a behavioral queer stereotype and more tied in with the actual queer experience of feeling fundamentally separated from the concept of a fairy tale love story happy ending. Disney villains are usually placed in ideological opposition to the straight romance in their movies. Ursula casually tells Ariel to seduce Prince Eric by relying on her looks and the importance of body language rather than getting to know each other as people. Jafar tries to use genie magic to make Jasmine love him to completely undercut her whole narrative about being free to choose, which is actually interesting because Aladdin actually spends most of the movie also trying to manipulate Jasmine because he's afraid she could never love the real him. Gaston seemingly can't conceive of a paradigm where people might like people for reasons deeper than physicality and thus might not be into him. Hades actively manipulates Hercules by using his love for Megara as his weakness, and Maleficent's whole evil plan is based on the idea that true love's kiss will never happen. Disney villains consistently either dismiss true love or reduce it to physical attraction. Classic Disney villains are disconnected from the concept of true love in a way that could resonate pretty well with an audience that grew up with no love stories they could personally relate to. This is a bit of a reach, I know, but it is a common experience that might help explain why this specific flavor of queer-coded villain resonates as well as it does. Now, of course, as we've discussed earlier, queer subjects have become a lot less taboo in the last few decades. Queer coding
Okay, hold on. I do want to talk about the Korra Asami one. And how Nickelodeon really just screwed over the creators of that. Because yeah, if you watch the show itself, because of how Nickelodeon was like, no, don't do it, it does kind of it doesn't, that relationship between Korra and Asami, they just hold hands at the end, doesn't really, unless you, I don't know, unless you're actively looking deeper or going online into internet spaces and reading about it, I think if you were to just watch Legend of Korra on its own, not interact with the internet at all, I don't think most people are going to be yeah, they're getting together, because that vibe wasn't there to me. If anything, I kind of feel like Korra probably could have just been asexual, honestly. Maybe she was trying to her going around and dating Mako and who's the other dude? No, I'm forgetting the dude's name. Mako's brother. Shit. He was my favorite character too in the show. But Bolin, that's what it is. Mako and Bolin, I think. No, it's not Bolin. Bolin is someone else. Fuck. Anyways, I kind of feel like Aura may just with maybe her struggle with relationships and stuff like that could have been tied to being Arrow Ace. Maybe that just reveals something about me that I'm not sure about. I don't know. No, I know I'm not a romantic. I know that one for sure. But you know what I'm saying? So also this does tie into what a person's own personal preferences in terms of their sexuality is what they will see like in the people that they watch on in media, right? Like I feel like that's the biggest thing. Now, of course, like there are I can't think of any like Merlin and King Arthur from the Merlin BBC show that ran from like 2008 to 2013. 100% gay couple, right? Like as a man that likes women, even I can be like, yeah, I can 100% see the connotation there. Um, but like, and how also I can easily see how people can interpret their relationship as like they're pining for one another, right? Um, but then of course I feel like there are some that are just more up in the air and really up to person's own individual experience and perspective. Don't know if any of that made sense. I don't even know if I made the point that I was trying to make.
Still happens on the regular, but we're also getting canon queer representation, and these tropes have been interacting in very strange ways. Plenty of media has been adding positive representation, where heroes are allowed to be canonically queer on screen. But the queer-coded villain is such a well-established trope at this point that some creators feel safer making villains explicitly queer than heroes. Shades of that old moral absolutism are still there. Heroes are heroic and positive role models, and giving them character traits that are not unilaterally regarded as positive can be seen as a risky play. I briefly touched on this in the anti-hero video.
Hold on, but another thing though, like at least in the way I kind of interpret it or have seen it, I think part of it is, as she said earlier, the self-confidence of the villain. And for whatever reason, our society, I think especially like American society at the very least, does not we do not like our, like you can look at Lord of the Rings as an like, so just Western society in general does not like our protagonist to be self-confident. And so I think, right, like you can look at Aragorn, who does have probably also what we would consider, or what older people would consider, feminine traits, though I just consider them positive masculine traits still in a sense, as Tolkien would have as well. But right, Aragorn is in the movies is not confident in him. He's confident in himself, but he's not like, he is still humble, right? And so whatever reason, perhaps because of the history of film and cinema, it has become, right, we have become to associate not being humble with also them being queer, right? Them being self-confident, we have associated so much so with being queer that maybe now we have a hard time separating those two from each other, even though, right, realistically, self-confidence and being queer is not at all a one-to-one thing. There are so many the majority of queer people that I know are just as insecure about themselves as me. So, right? Like, it's not they don't go together, but for whatever reason, when it comes to our media, when we see a villain have self-confidence, we also assume them to be queer for whatever reason. That one I don't see as much. Like I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I have heard people say this villain is queer coded, and I've been like, and really they've only said like there's the character, the self-confidence of the character, and I've just been like, no, I don't see that one, but individual perception.
2, because it's easier for a writer to give an anti-hero a potentially spicy character trait like a queer identity because it feels like less of a gamble. And this pervasive fear is responsible for a whole bunch of tropes in this space. Bury Your Gaze, for instance, is the trope where a canon queer character dies fairly quickly, often shortly after their orientation or identity is officially confirmed. And this
Man, I really should have saved this video for Pride Month.
happens because, frankly, a lot of writers feel safer when their controversial characters are dead. They get to reap the positive cloud of acknowledging that this identity exists, but they don't need to worry about actually handling the character well. Of course, bury your
Yeah.
gays is a long-standing trope also rooted in the Hays Code, since punishing immorality was a huge part of the whole premise, so killing off queer characters was the respectable thing for these movies to do. Same stuff, different decade. Queerbaiting is a comparatively new trope in this general space, as it's queer coding with an inherently positive angle. A creator will hint to the audience that canon positive queer content might be coming in order to draw in an audience that wants to see that kind of representation, and then sometimes they deliver the barest bit of canon queer content before snapping the camera away and often killing the character just to be safe. Reap the brownie points of acknowledging queer stuff as a thing, but don't actually write it into your story in any.
Yeah, but also apparently the things have come out about our boy about our boy Bilbo here. uh and ugh, that he's got some not good opinions.
Meaningful way, because that's hard and scary and people might get mad. Queerbaiting is queer coding for people who want more queer content, and it's harmful in all the same ways. For some writers, queer coding and queer baiting can feel like a safe alternative to actual queer representation. You never need to worry about actually writing the queer content if you just keep hinting at it or dropping in stereotypes the audience can read into.
This is like I can both see like why the I can absolutely see the frustration of the whole are they gay or just good friends kind of angle, right? I can understand, I can completely understand that frustration. But also a part of me kind of I am someone that very much likes the idea of, to a certain extent, there are certain things in a story that I think need to be completely like left without questions. Like there are certain things, but like then there are other parts, like um like really relationships in most cases. In most cases, there's like the central protagonist. Perhaps I kind of want to know like who they're gonna end up with. That's just me. I like to know, like, for the very least, I want this. I want to know the central protagonist's arc. Like with a relationship, are they ending up with someone or are they not? And who are they ending up with? So in regards to the central protagonist, knowing whether or not are they gay or are they just good friends is a question that should be answered by the author and should not be baited. But like with side characters and stuff like that, for me, I kind of like the whole um in a lot of things I like the whole author leaving it up in the air for the interpretation of the audience, because yes, I am telling a story that is important to me, right? Because this is the story that I want to tell, but also you can't control the audience, and I don't want to be a like you don't want I don't I don't want to be like that author that goes in and be like, no, your interpretation of that is wrong. Like for certain things, like I want a bunch of things to be like kind of up to interpretation of the audience, of like, individual perception of a character. Like I see myself in that character, even though that may not be my intent. Um, or maybe it was for a certain group of people to feel represented by that character. I'm not gonna be going out and confirming nor denying that because I don't want I guess the brownie points of that. It's like I'm just, it's like that's how the character turned out. And if you feel represented by that character, then amazing, right? The only people I don't want to represent there are some, but one of the groups of people that I do not want to represent positively in my world are colonists, right? Pieces of shit. Fascists, authoritarians. Those aren't going to be represented positively in my books. But everyone else, I want to put in an effort to represent. But I'm not going to be marketing my book like, it has this representation. It's like I took inspiration from, let's say, that culture, or this character is this way because it just felt natural for that character to be gay, pan, whatever, right? And so, but I'm not gonna be like, publicly toting it. And maybe for one character, right, it's not necessary. It isn't needed for the story for me to say like, or for to even be described like, yeah, they are in this and this kind of relationship, right? Like it's a side character, um, and maybe within the vein of the story, they just don't end up in a relationship, so therefore it isn't needed at all within the context of the story that I'm telling for me to have a for it to be said like this character likes this and this, right? So then, but then like a reader could interpret and be like, well, I think this character after the story is over goes and uh gets with a man, or they get with maybe they're just asexual, or something like that, and it's just like, yeah, if that's your interpretation of the character, fuck yeah, it's cool. If that's what you see in the character, and then but someone else sees another thing in a character, me, then I feel like I made a good character. I don't know, right? Like, I don't know if any of that made sense either. I feel like I'm not making any
On
sense.
some level, we've circled back around to confirmed bachelors and lavender weddings and plausible deniability because queer identities haven't quite shaken off that veneer of social unacceptability that makes people nervous or ashamed to touch on them in any
I essentially just don't want to be one of those like um authors that looks like me and just goes out and like markets their book for and essentially baits queer baits, or markets it and perhaps does have it, but also like is kind of just having it there to have, like, I'm not like that. I don't want the brownie points. I'm doing it because like that's the world. People are complex and people have different preferences in all aspects of their life, right? Like that's why the that's that's why the characters are the way they are they are people, right? Like, ugh, never.
serious way. Modern queer-coded villains still have a lot of the baggage from the original Hays Code version, like how their queerness will sometimes be used to signal that they're extra unhinged or dangerous, tying back into the idea that it's something inherently abnormal and alarming. And certain identities get most of their on-screen representation by way of queer-coded villains. Most non-binary characters these days are explicitly non-human beings like genderless aliens or shapeshifters. Bisexuality and pansexuality get most of their
I do see that non-binary thing, and I think that one, yeah. I wonder. I'm really curious, like, if anyone could do research on the non-binary one and why. Uh, like I know, I think two have told me that they are. Actually, one, both of them, I think, may no longer be non-binary. I think they may have become more comfortable in one. I think has become more masculine. Has identified more as masculine as gone. Uh, they've explored themselves further. That's the right way to like explain it. Another, I think they've gone more feminine. Um, but no, I've known a couple, known a few non-binary people, and it's just like, why is it in our stories that we, you know, don't represent any humans as non-binary? I don't think I've read a story actually with a non-binary human character. I'm really trying to think, and I don't think I have yet. Huh. Huh.
through very promiscuous characters, often with cheating subplots, and if you're asexual or aromantic, most of your good rep comes from robots, and the rest of your rep comes from evil villains incapable of understanding what it is to truly
Yeah.
love. Now,
Yeah, the asexual one is also one that, like, how that one came to be, again, it also seems a little, you know, weird because, like, especially with America being kind of Puritan, right? You would think kind of asexuality would actually be more positively representative, but it's not. Like, we have such a weird relationship to things that are outside of man and woman.
Now, before I and sign off, a whole bunch of other YouTubers have made videos related to this that you might want to check out. Lindsay Ellis's Tracing the Roots of Pop Culture Transphobia video is an extremely in-depth look at one very specific side of the queer-coded villains trope and how trans-coded villainy specifically evolved, while
Lindsay Ellis just has fucking amazing videos. It's just a shame that I think, or at least this is, I can't remember how long ago she said this, but I think she quit YouTube, right? Because you, like, I don't remember why.
Sarah Zed's The John Locke Conspiracy and Dusty Elgate videos talk about queer baiting in BBC's Sherlock and the CW's Supernatural, respectively. H-Bomber Guy's Sherlock is garbage and here's...
I'm upset that there has been no discussion, that she hasn't talked about Merlin, BBC. She's talking about Sherlock. But Merlin...
My video also has a fun bit discussing BBC Sherlock's portrayal of Moriarty and how they deliberately queer-coded him to make him seem scarier and more unhinged, which is, exactly what we were talking about today. Dominic Noble's Lost in Adaptation video about the 1945 The Picture of Dorian Gray also briefly touches on the Hays Code and how it might have led them to reduce the queer coding of Dorian to make him more redeemable by their standards. There's also, like, a million videos and podcasts about Disney villains being queer-coded queens, so yeah, have fun with that. It's a lot. A lot. So, yeah, and thanks again to Campfire Blaze.
Still literally no mention of Merlin. A little disappointed. I'm not gonna lie. But that was Trope Talk, queer-coded villains. I don't know if my ramblings made any sense today, or if I even made any points. This was a good video. Red, of course, always does a fantastic job. She's very good at writing her scripts. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more. I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.